Photography? Yeah, a few hands, yeah, I need some of those. I enjoy taking pictures and photography as well. I kind of always have, just as a hobby. And the more I learn about it, the more I admire people who can do it really, really well. It's not easy, to craft and create and design the perfect picture. And it's incredible how some people are just able to do it so, so well. But it has gotten easier to take better pictures more recently. And the shift from film to digital photography, I think, might have been one of the greatest shifts to taking better pictures. I'll admit, I was one of the holdouts. I was one of the people who resisted the shift from film photography to digital photography. My loyalist tendencies to film, I was holding on to them very tight. But there was one day when I made the change, and it happened very quickly. I need to tell you a couple stories about it to get there. My first camera was my dad's Nikon F1. If you've had a Nikon F1, the thing weighs about 50 pounds, but it was an amazing camera. It was one of the first and the best, smallest SLR cameras, had great optics, fantastic quality. In addition to being heavy, though, one of the problems is it took forever to take a picture. Because there was no auto anything. It was manual everything. Light metering was manual, focus was manual. So you made all your adjustments, and by the time you've made all your adjustments, the people who were smiling are no longer smiling, and the dog that was sitting is now down the street 2 blocks licking a tree, and everybody's just done. They don't want to take a picture. So it's a great camera, but it's tough. When I was in college, or just at the end of college, I got some gifts from some family and some friends that allowed me to consider buying my own first camera that was mine from the beginning. And I had this decision to make, because this was in the late 90s when the shift was happening from film to digital. And I had this decision, do I buy digital or do I stick with film? Well, this is my first camera that I bought, and it takes film. I went with film. Now, for those of you that grew up on film cameras, you know how this works very well. For those of you that have never seen a film camera, and there are a few, let me give you a little lesson. So instead of taking 9,000 pictures without worrying about anything, there's this thing called film. 24 or 36 exposures is all you get. Can you see the pictures after you took them? No, you have no idea what you took until you take it to a lab, and then 3 days later or an hour later, if you're willing to spend the money, you get your pictures back in singles or duplicates. You can have your doubles. So the way it works is you put your film back here in the camera. You stick it on here, the film goes across here, and every time you take a picture, it winds the film. One picture, next picture, next picture, next picture. When you're all done, you wind it back. Lesson done. So, about this time, as I had this camera, a friend of mine, my roommate, one of my good friends, he said, hey, I've got to go flying because I need to keep my flying hours up for my license. Do you want to go with me? And I said, well, sure, I want to go with you. Who wouldn't want to go with you? Flying over the coastline and the ocean? Sure, I'll go with you. So he took me up. We met together after work one evening. We went up and I brought a camera. Because who wouldn't want to take pictures of this gorgeous scenery? We were living in Santa Barbara at the time. Beautiful sunset view over the hills and the coast and the ocean. I thought this was going to be great. So we get to the airport, he takes me up, we fly over the foothills toward the south end of town, and we kind of point out all the things that we are familiar with, the things we know. And as the sun has just set, he turns the plane around, we start to come back up the coastline. And as we're coming back up the coast, the sky is just perfect. It's like the sunset you mentioned. The magenta, the cyan colors, just enough clouds to make it super pretty, and I am just snapping pictures. It is so much fun. We get back, and it's just about dark as we land. land the plane, get out of the plane, and I'm just like, thank you, that was a great trip. I wish I had a picture to show you. But my film did not catch the winder in the camera. And that was the day that I switched to digital. Oftentimes, we have to tell one story to get to the real story. We often have to say all this stuff in this background to say, this is the deal. All four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, tell stories about Jesus. And they tell them in their own unique ways. But none of them actually start with Jesus being born. They all have to tell these other stories in order to get to Jesus being born. And they're amazing stories. So take Mark, take the book of Mark, for example. This is how the book of Mark starts. It says, this is the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. It began just as the prophet Isaiah had written. Look, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, and he will prepare your way. He has a voice shouting in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord's coming, clear the road for him. Mark actually includes more than just Isaiah, even though he says Isaiah. He includes a whole lot more. Because Mark saw that there were these different things that had been said for a long period of time that he noticed and wove together and said, this is where I need to start. Because this story happened a long time before Jesus actually came. What is Mark's starting point? Or specifically, when is Mark's starting point? Because he's got Isaiah, and he's got Malachi, and he's got another prophet in there. He's got so many lines and ways of seeing how Jesus was actually supposed to come. I mean, he saw that Isaiah was 700 years or so before Jesus. But there was something that was said, and the story told then. There was Malachi that was 400 years before Jesus came. But there was something about this event. There was the Exodus, way back in the Exodus, 1,500 or so years before Jesus. And that still was part of the story. And Mark sees these things, and he says, hold on. All these things are pointing to this. And if we start here, we're missing all this that gives meaning to it, that makes sense of it. And that's how we can finally understand all of it. So he puts all that together as if to say, the story doesn't start now, the story started so long ago. And if we do all this story, then it's going to make a whole lot more sense. Mark also includes these few lines, these few interwoven messages from their Old Testament world for a big reason. Their Bible was the Old Testament. And so when people had the Old Testament, they divided it into sections, kind of like we divide the Bible into different sections or groupings of books. They divided theirs into sections. And if God said something in a section, they thought, hey, God said it, that's important. But if they noticed that God said it in this section, but then God said the same thing in this section, and then God said it again in this section, people are like, oh, God means business. This is a big deal. I should listen up. These three places that Mark raises, these messages, these things that God had said about Jesus coming, they're in three of the different sections of their Old Testament world. And so when Mark sees these, he said, wait a minute, God said it here, and here, and here. Oh, now I get this. This is a big deal. I need to listen up. Mark realized this is a big story that's pointing to something big. What does Mark also call his whole thing that he's talking about? Right from the beginning of the book, Mark describes, I am going to tell you the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. He's not just saying, hey, I had a really good day at school, and I have some good news to share. Or, hey, I heard this really cool story. I had some really good news. He's talking about something that's been crafted. Something that's been created. Something that's been designed and put together. He's talking about this message that God has woven together, that's been crafted, that Mark has put together to be able to share with people about Jesus. That's the starting point for Mark's story. What is your starting point for your story about Jesus? We all have stories to share about Jesus. How Jesus came into our lives, how we met Jesus, who helped us understand something new about Jesus, how we discovered something we didn't know before, how Jesus changed our lives. It could be a person, it could be an event, it could be a whole series and long string of events. Could have been one of those knock you over kind of moments. Where's your starting point when you would describe your story about Jesus? Mark does something also peculiar in this passage as well. It's where he starts his story. I'm talking about location, geographic location. See, with Jesus, I would have imagined he would have said, like we introduce a lot of other people, hi, my friend Jesus, he was born in Bethlehem on this certain day, and his parents were Mary and Joseph, and he grew up in Nazareth, and, where somebody was born, we often say their hometown, or the state they grew up in, or the city they grew up in. But that's not where Mark starts. What location is Mark starting in? He's starting in the wilderness. Why on earth is Mark starting in the wilderness? That Jesus was not born in the wilderness. The wilderness was not the place Jesus grew up, so why does Mark start in the wilderness? Well, where else does the wilderness show up? Big stories, common stories in the Bible. The wilderness was where the people of God wandered for years, and actually they camped for years and years. They wandered for a little bit. But it's the wilderness wandering. They spent years in the wilderness. What did the people travel across to go into exile in the Old Testament? They traveled from their homeland in Jerusalem across a vast wilderness to get to exile. If we jump ahead in the story of Jesus, where did Jesus go before he kind of started all of his ministry? He was tempted in the wilderness. What happens in the Bible in the wilderness? It's like people are here before they get there. People were wandering in the wilderness before they got to the promised land. People had to cross through the wilderness to exile before they could cross through the wilderness to come back home. Jesus was tempted in the wilderness before he started the mission that God gave him to fulfill. The wilderness is like preparation ground. The wilderness prepares us. It's that period of time when we're getting ready, when God's doing some work, when things are happening, we're being prepared for something else. So when John the Baptist comes on, as Mark describes, and he's talking about preparing, there's a voice of one shouting in the wilderness, prepare the way. There's some preparation going on there. What kind of preparation happened in the wilderness? Bill read it for us earlier. Clear the roads, level the valleys, fill the valleys, level the mountains, make the rough places smooth. Do all this prep work for somebody to come. In their day, it was like a leader would come and they would need to prepare the ground, make the trip easier, make the road smoother, make it simpler for somebody to come. If we had somebody famous or good or big coming into Visalia, we might repave Main Street, we might plant a lot of flowers, we might get the traffic away and let nobody park there, we might clean up the area, we might prepare for the one who's coming. Mark describes several ways that we can prepare for Jesus' coming. They may not be the most popular ways of preparing for somebody to come, but he is serious about how to prepare for Jesus to come. So here's how Mark describes John the Baptist and preparing for Jesus. It says this message was John the Baptist. Messenger was John the Baptist. He was in the wilderness and preached that people should be baptized to show they had repented of their sins and turned to God and be forgiven. All of Judea, including all the people of Jerusalem, went out to see and hear John. And when they confessed their sins, he baptized them in the Jordan River. His clothes were woven from coarse camel hair, and he wore a leather belt around his waist. For food, he ate locusts and wild honey. John is all about preparation. So let's observe. What does John do to prepare people? He preaches and he baptizes. Why does he baptize? 2 reasons. He baptizes to show that people have repented of their sins and turned to God. In other words, turned away from sin and turned toward God. Is the indicator that this has happened. John's whole ministry was about repent of your sins and turn to God. How popular was John? Oh, he was super popular. I mean, look how many people came from Jerusalem, from Judea, from all the areas around. John was popular. People came from everywhere to see him. And there were people that were constantly being baptized and turning to God. The message was huge and it was going out and people were responding to John's message. It was big preparation time for these people. And John was at the heart of helping to prepare people for Jesus coming. We set aside these weeks in Advent at this time of year as preparation. Do we have to prepare for Christmas? No. We could get to Christmas. We don't have to prepare. But it's not going to be the same. We attended a Williams cross-country team awards night this week. And there was a group of about 45 or so of their teammates that were sitting in the middle of the room, and all the families and others were sitting on the outside. And what the coach did is he called every one of them up one by one. He called them up to give them a certificate or an award or something else, and he talked about every single student, about what he affirmed about them, even some words about, hey, you could do this better next year, and I'm excited about it. Some fun, quirky stories about things that these students have done that were just standouts in his mind. Lots of neat affirmations that were given to these runners. The most common thing that he said about all of these students is their commitment and their dedication to just show up. To run the runs they were given, to do the stretches they were given, to work out like they were given, and to not skip practice. They were rewarded with better times, and their coaches affirming them and encouraging them because they prepared. From the runner who was the slowest to the runner who was the top on the team, they all had to prepare. It's good to prepare for something big that's happening. And it's good to prepare for Jesus coming. This story of John the Baptist is in all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But our friend Mark does one thing that's different. He adds in something at the end to this story and his experience that's just unique. It's this part at the end. John announced, someone is coming soon who is greater than I am, so much greater than I am, not even worthy to stoop down like a slave and untie the straps of his sandals. I baptize you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. Now, why would Mark include this? I mean, we know about John. We know John was popular. He had a message. It was a clear message, a big message. People responded to the message. And this John character is saying, even I'm not worthy anything compared to this one who's coming. The people who heard that are probably thinking, are you kidding? You are awesome. You're amazing. So who is coming? This is the whole adventure that Mark sets us on to find out who is this Jesus and what is he about and why is he coming and what's he doing. We have never looked at Advent before as an adventure. We've looked at Advent in a lot of ways over the last several years, but we've never looked at it as an adventure. When you're on an adventure, what happens? Your eyes open up, you start looking for clues, you're motivated to find that thing that you're trying to figure out, heart races a little more, gather some resources, figure out who can help. This can be an adventure of finding this Jesus who is coming again. We have lots of ways designed. They're online, they're in print, they're in bulletin, they're coming out of email, they're everywhere. You can't miss all the things that we're trying to do during Advent. These and any other things are ways to prepare, ways to get ready, ways to try to be on this adventure of seeing this Jesus who is coming. A couple questions just to keep us thinking about what's the next step. Where do I start my Jesus story? How would you say? Where do I start my Jesus story? And what are a couple of ways that I can prepare for Jesus coming? Let's pray.